We still have some people joining, but I think let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar on some work we're really excited to bring to you today on 24/7 carbon-free transition tariffs, carbon-free electricity transition tariffs. This is a topic that RAP has been working on for about a year, almost a year and a half now. And we've produced our report and made that available to you. Today is our first webinar on the topic. Today with you, along with me, I have David Farnsworth, Nancy Seidman, and Sean Interline helping with our presentation today. Our 24/7 work was informed by a stakeholder group that met with us in monthly meetings over the last year, with more than 100 folks coming, many of whom chose to meet with us on a monthly basis. But of course, the work we present is ours and should not be presumed to be the views of our stakeholders. So welcome. So the mode of interacting with you today, you are muted, but you do have the opportunity to participate by offering questions through the question and answer pane. There's a helpful graphic up right now to show you that pane, and please find your way to that if you have any questions you'd like to submit. We will pause in the middle for some clarifying questions and then have a more extensive question and answer time at the end. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the thing that first attracted our attention to this, or not first, but one of the things that attracted our attention was the United Nations 24/7 Global Compact. That Global Compact offers nations, states, organizations, and individuals the opportunity to commit to a 24/7 goal. The Compact explains 24/7 and offers principles for implementing 24/7. We're going to be more precise in a minute, but for now, it's enough to say that basically a 24/7 commitment is a commitment to meet one's consumption with carbon-free electricity every hour of every day and to choose carbon-free resources according to one's policy priorities. This means that 24/7 is a carbon-free, technology-agnostic approach, and it leaves room for resources ranging from aggregated demand resources and virtual power plants to the whole gamut of carbon-free supply-side resources. More than 140 entities have already signed on to the compact, and many of these entities are large with operations in many places. So this means that there's the challenge of starting a new tariff in many different places and many different contexts. And so we undertook this work hoping to provide some guidance to those who are trying to implement in many different places. One thing I want to make sure to mention is that we are talking about transition tariffs. So the importance of the word transition is that we understand that transition to 24/7 every hour of every day is something that will require investment and happen over time. So the tariff is structured to make progress towards 24/7 immediately, while at the same time laying a foundation for planning to meet 24/7 100% of the time over time. Next slide. One notable entity that has chosen to sign on to 24/7 is our federal government. Federal government joined in December of 2023. The U.S. government now faces the challenge of establishing and subscribing to 24/7s for many different facilities in dozens of different utilities in many different states. We hope this report provides fundamentals that will be helpful to the federal government as well as to local governments, community choice aggregators, small and large corporations, and individuals. So how does 24/7 differ from the annual matching tariffs, the green power tariffs, that have been around for a couple of decades. 24/7 is a green power tariff, but it's different. It's different in that legacy green power tariffs are focused on annual matching. Annual matching tariffs seek to match annual consumption with annual green energy credits of some sort. These tariffs have been helpful in driving large-scale renewable energy development, and they've been very popular with customers. The tariffs have been very helpful, but annual matching does not consider the timing of green energy production or the location of that production. As a result, customers subscribing to annual green energy tariffs will find that in many hours of the year, they are depending on carbon emitting resources, sometimes very high carbon emitting resources. Hourly matching with deliverability requirements addresses this mismatch. By tracking hourly consumption and hourly resource emissions, 24/7 identifies those places and hours where available deliverable carbon-free resources are needed to fill out a 24/7 portfolio. This is important because it places a value on carbon-free resources that are local or that can be delivered locally. By establishing that value, it induces investment in technologies and infrastructure that can support 24/7 carbon-free electricity in those high-emitting times and places. So what we found in our stakeholder process is that both customers and utilities are interested in implementing 24/7. Some reasons that customers gave us for wanting to implement 24/7 include it provides hourly decarbonization assurance. It engages local resources, for example, aggregated DERs or virtual power plants. It builds local jobs. It accelerates new technology and it can support local resilience. Finally, it gives them an opportunity to demonstrate leadership in using carbon-free resources every hour of the year. Utilities are also interested. One reason they're interested is some existing customers are coming forward and asking for them. In addition, some new customers who are thinking about where to locate facilities are coming forward and seeing whether a 24/7 tariff is available should they choose to locate in their state. It clarifies capital investment priorities vis-a-vis non-utility investments. 24/7 attempts to bring together customer investments, other non-utility investments, and utility investments in a way that is complementary and keeps costs down for all customers. So this process helps to clarify the utility's role in capital investment. And finally, it often supports state decarbonization policies that the utilities are interested in complying with. So we set about to identify some foundations for how 24/7 transition tariffs should be structured, and we came up with 5 fundamentals. And today's webinar is going to be focused on presenting you these 5 fundamentals. The first fundamental is to integrate the transition tariff investments with ongoing utility planning. There should be a recognition of what the utility is already doing. There should be a recognition of what investments and resources non-utilities and customers are bringing to the market. And there should be an attempt to integrate those investments and perhaps modify the utility plans to align with a complementary optimized group. Next, please. The second fundamental is to ensure accurate hourly emissions tracking and verification. Customers are signing up for a tariff that promises matching of production, carbon-free production with consumption, and there should be some assurance that you're getting what you pay for. So ensuring accurate hourly emissions is the second fundamental. The third fundamental is to design the tariffs to accelerate complementary investments. To the extent that we can bring in complementary investments and investment dollars from non-utility entities and from customers. We can decarbonize without impacting non-participating customers. We can choose to co-optimize these things to make it beneficial both to the participating customer and the non-participating customer. So that's our third fundamental. Our fourth fundamental is to employ rate design to ensure fairness and to align carbon-free electricity grid needs with pricing and compensation. So we will talk in our fourth fundamental about rate making and rate design principles to achieve this goal. And finally, our fifth fundamental is to integrate operating systems to implement hourly matching. So to get us started today, I will introduce you now to Sean. Oh, excuse me, not quite yet. So how do these five fundamentals work together? So the five fundamentals work together in a virtuous cycle to reduce emissions. The five fundamentals drive incremental investment, as shown in the graph in the lower right. The right-hand axis shows the dollars of investment. The upward sloping turquoise arrow represents increased quantity of investment over time, incremental investment. On the left-hand axis, you can see emissions measured. The upper dotted line represents the business as usual emissions that would be experienced absent 24/7. The lower dotted line represents the decreased level of emissions that can be enjoyed with those incremental investments. So with that, now we'll get started with our first fundamental, and I'll turn it over to Sean.
Thank you very much, Carl, and good afternoon, everybody. This first fundamental is about integrating the transition tariff itself with utility planning. And you might ask why? Why do those two need to be more tightly related? And the answer is that these tariffs are taking a complicated task, delivering cleaner energy to customers who want it, and they're engaging those customers and creating a solution. And that takes planning. We began, as Carl mentioned, with the United Nations Clean Energy Compact. They have published 5 principles that we started with last summer. And through stakeholder engagement, that list grew to 8 that are listed here in this table. We're just going to highlight 3 to give you a feel for our thinking and how they inform planning. The first is just to acknowledge we've got this tariff, which creates a one-to-one relationship between a customer and utility, but that in practice, from an engineering and system operations perspective, we're delivering that on that one-to-one obligation with a many-to-many relationship. We're aggregating up many customers and their demand for clean energy, and then matching it up to various resources on both the supply and the demand side. So that's the relationship between the principle and the planning in that instance. The second principle we want to highlight is geographic deliverability. This was a great topic that started a lot of good conversations last summer. And the point here isn't to settle those conversations so much as to acknowledge that the act of aggregating uploads and matching them up with resources requires you to define some boundaries on the electric system and therefore in geographic space. So this principle is acknowledging that. And I'll end this one by saying we chose the balancing authority in our work to be a very natural place for planners to engage in that conversation around what resources need to be matched up. Lastly, technology neutrality as a principle became important for a couple of reasons. First off, every jurisdiction is coming to the table with existing resources that are unique to their place and time. But the other thing that's unique is that they're on policy priorities. They may choose to prioritize some sources of clean energy over others, and we wanted to acknowledge that through this principle. Next slide deals with the 3 types of investment that the tariffs are designed to encourage. We already mentioned the technology neutrality, and if you look backwards, that's about existing utility investment. You might think existing hydro, existing wind, existing nuclear, for instance. We want to make the most of those resources. In a planner's lingo, you might say optimize. The tariff also wants to encourage non-utility investment, however. These are investments that ratepayers haven't necessarily had to pay for. And that could be behind the retail meter. It could be much larger scale in front of the retail meter. But in both cases, those resources have the potential to benefit all customers. And we really want to bring them into the planning process for that reason. And then once we see what non-utility investments are occurring, and then planners take stock of the existing utility investment, they're in a really good position to design new utility investment. They're going to be complementary to the other two. So these two slides really roll up into a couple of recommendations. Let principles inform your planning is the first. And the second is two-part. We want to give a shout out to the NARUC-NASIO Energy Planning Task Force, which did some great work that acknowledged some of these differences in structure and policy and different jurisdictions, and to apply those planning processes with an eye towards making progress, but not seeking perfection right away. Just keep the long-term goal of cleaner and cleaner energy in mind. And with that, we'll cover fundamental number 2 with David Farnsworth.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we can move ahead here. So as this figure sets out, the idea to enable hourly matching, first you need a load-serving entity to produce hourly customer load data that could be matched with time-stamped and hourly attribute certificates, ideally from a standardized national all-generation tracking system. Of course, where that's not possible, a useful near-term solution, one that's been adopted in Europe, would be to take existing tracking systems and to meet the same standards and follow similar practices. Next, like the established practice with today with renewable energy certificates, no one takes credit until the relevant certificate is accounted for and retired. So developing this capability will require the standardization and the adoption of a series of emissions tracking procedures and related practices. And to this end, we identified 5 recommendations. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. Recommendation 1, for customers to understand their energy use and for systems to be interoperable across different jurisdictions that are going to be adopting 24/7 transition tariffs, utilities should adopt accounting systems with consistent reporting formats to represent customer load data. Recommendation 2, load-serving entities should recognize that complementary emissions accounting approaches are required to understand the implications of adopting 24/7 tariffs. Now, our inquiry into developing a tariff for 24/7 CFE has made it clear that not only are we developing recommendations for a tariff design, but also principles that will shape the planning necessary to inform any decision about adopting a 24/7 transition tariffs. So for this reason, we need approaches to emissions accounting suited to both of those tasks. Consequential emissions accounting is a method for modeling how environmental impacts, in this case, emission impacts on the grid, would change in response to a certain action or intervention, such as the development of a 24/7 tariff. Market-based attributional accounting, on the other hand, is suited to supporting a tariff design because it establishes inventories of emissions and removals within a defined inventory boundary, such as the portfolio of generation resources that an LSE would assemble to meet customer needs under a 24/7 transition tariff. I'm going to hand this off to Nancy.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Thanks to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. So there are 3 more recommendations related to standardization and adoption of emission tracking. The first one I'm going to talk about concerns best available emissions data. So in populating emissions accounting systems for hourly CFE energy attribute certificates, we think that the load-serving entities, or LSEs, should recognize that relevant emissions data is almost always publicly available and should be used whenever possible. If not, then emissions can be calculated using the best available information. Our report provides a hierarchy of the available data and recommendations for using the available energy and emissions data. The second recommendation related to the standardization concerns establishing geographic market boundaries, which Sean actually touched on earlier. Articulating market boundaries and promoting energy delivery are important in voluntary clean energy markets, particularly when buyers claim to consume the clean energy that they purchase. Energy delivered or capable of being delivered into one's balancing authority is often the basis for an energy transaction. And the concept of deliverability is a financial convention to ensure that producers and buyers can connect and engage in transactions for the purchase and sale of electric energy drawn from the grid. So we recommend the geographic boundaries are established using local service areas, like the scale of an RTO or a balancing authority, as shown in this graphic from FERC. And our last recommendation in Fundamental 2 on standardization discusses allocating existing clean CFE, carbon-free electricity, to participants and non-participants and ensuring that they are treated fairly. As states explore adopting 24/7 tariffs, it's important to support the first movers, but also to avoid harming non-participants by allocating existing CFE in proportion to the entity's existing resource mix. Giving credit to a 24/7 transition tariff customer for more than what that customer has historically responsible for supporting deprives remaining ratepayers of the benefits of the resources for which they have already paid in rates. The Entergy Arkansas 24/7 tariff, designed on behalf of the federal government, provides a good example of this, and we're happy to discuss this in Q&A if there's interest. And with that, I think we're going to pause now for any clarifying questions before moving to Fundamental 3. Carl, I don't know what we have in the Q&A that we might want to address now.
In the way of clarifying questions, I think the two questions that we have are better saved till the end. But if anyone has a clarifying question they want to pop in. Okay, here's a good one. How do you define CFE? Dave, do you want to answer that one?
So I'm happy to give it a shot, Carl. So we haven't defined carbon-free energy in a specific way. What we're trying to do is identify resources that have lower emissions than typical traditional fossil resources that folks have relied upon. In our work here, we've tried to be technology neutral, and we've tried to make sure that we want folks who are thinking about developing these tariffs to develop that list themselves and to go through a process similar to the planning process that Sean referred to, where you engage the public and make sure that as many people are on the same page when it comes to developing a list of carbon-free electricity resources. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Dave. There's another question in here about asking for clarification between attributional accounting versus the alternative.
I'm happy to give that a shot.
Sure.
Hi, Mike. It's nice to have you on the webinar today. If a state was going to develop an electricity policy, or if a utility was going to develop electricity policy, like a renewable portfolio standard, for instance, or expanding a renewable portfolio standard, what they would do is capacity expansion modeling. They would look at what this new policy would do to the market out there, to existing generators, to the existing ability to deliver electricity around the system. And part of that modeling would be looking at the emissions that result from a policy being implemented. You can do that with, we recommend doing that with 24/7 tariff. And modeling that, I'm not a modeler, as you know, but are you modeling a tariff with adoption rate of 1% or 20%? What's it going to do to your system? And when it comes down to looking at the emissions effects of that policy on the system, you're going to engage in what they call consequential emissions accounting. You're positing a baseline, and then you're doing a counterfactual to look at what the effects of a given policy will be. Now, we said that that's an important step to take when a state thinks about developing, or a utility thinks about developing this tariff. But there's also the need to look at what is referred to as attributional accounting. In other words, what are the emissions associated with the resources that you're going to put in your portfolio to serve customers under this tariff? And that's a different focus. And instead of looking out at the system, what you're doing is focusing on the emissions attributes of the resources that you're putting into the portfolio and serving folks with. So that's the main distinction.
Thanks, Dave. I think there's one more question here that I think belongs now as a clarifying question. And Sean, it's the question from Michael McCrae that I'm going to read now and see if you'd like to answer that. Do the principles laid out here map directly to the three pillars discussed in the 24/7 context, that is, requiring deliverable, time-matched CFE from new resources?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Carl, and thank you, Michael. I think at a high level, the answer is an unequivocal yes. The nuance I would offer is around new. The way we wrote it up and the way I think about it is, to the extent there are carbon-free resources already existing on the system, those can be made eligible at the jurisdiction's discretion. At the same time, the principles do include the principle that encourages new generation. That doesn't mean everything has to be new. It means something has to be new as it's offered in the total product. So at a high level, yes, with a qualified nuance on the concept of not everything has to be new.
One final question, I guess, thank you, Sean. One final question I'll answer now before we move on. Jim Lazar asks, getting the last few percent of anything is typically pretty expensive. Is there a value in also offering a 95% clean product in terms of the cost to the consumer? And what I'd say to that, Jim, is a couple of things. First, we use the word transition tariff because we're aware of the fact that we're building towards 100% carbon-free 24/7 product over time. So there's not the intent to jump to 100%, but rather the intent to build towards 100%. Then I think the other part of your question is, does having an optional opt-in 24/7 carbon-free electricity transition tariff, does that spawn opportunities for offering other tariffs, like, for example, the one that you propose, a 95% carbon-free electricity tariff to customers generally? And I would say, yes, that is an anticipated benefit of this approach, is by building the capability to do time matching, that you can then offer a wider range of carbon-free electricity tariffs to customers more generally. Okay, with that, I think we'll continue on just to make our way through the rest of this material, and then we'll come back. If we didn't answer your question so far, we'll be coming back in a bit. So Donna, let's continue. So the third fundamental is it regards complementary investments from third-party customers or from non-utility customers in particular. With respect to this, we've talked about this a bit already. A very intentional part of 24/7 is the opportunity to bring in resources that complement ongoing utility investments and that shape complementary portfolios going forward. Customer investments and other non-utility investments can keep costs down and control risks for all customer if they're explicitly considered. So the recommendation with respect to Fundamental 3 is that we should factor in existing investments while providing transparency to customers so that the program, the 24/7 program, can ensure that customer-driven investments are truly complementary and accelerate decarbonization. The fourth fundamental is to employ rate design to ensure fairness and to align carbon-free electricity grid needs with pricing and compensation. First of all, it's worth noting that rate making for 24/7 transition tariffs happens in a policy context, and it can help to support that policy context. For example, the provision of safe, reliable, and resilient service. 24/7 tariffs can bring in resources that help with, particularly with resiliency. Meeting societal equity goals, 24/7 tariffs can align with that as well and should be considered along with that. 24/7 tariffs, like all other tariffs, should be implemented with an eye towards administrative feasibility. 24/7 tariffs are very explicitly trying to encourage innovation and allow for competition in areas of investment where it may not currently be occurring. And finally, 24/7 transition tariffs are closely related to public health and environmental goals that a state may have or a utility may have. So pursuing 24/7 goal may actually be helping to advance those public health and environmental goals at the same time. The rate-making goals for 24/7 are also familiar for other contexts. The tariff should be considered for its effectiveness in yielding the total revenue requirements needed. It should provide the customer with a clear understanding and acceptance of the terms of the tariff. It should account for an equitable allocation of costs and avoid undue discrimination. And finally, it should provide efficient price signals that encourage optimal customer behavior. So some rate-making points to emphasize in establishing a 24/7 transition tariff in particular include we're going to have to establish the rate structure. We're going to have to carefully define what the eligible load is for the tariff. We're going to need to establish the incremental costs associated with implementing the 24/7 program and carrying it out. And we're also going to need to establish and measure the incremental benefits that the 24/7 program and the resources that it brings provides generally to the participant and non-participant alike. And we're going to need to establish the duration of the tariff carefully. So finally, we have some recommendations for Fundamental 4 in implementing the transition tariff. The first recommendation is that we need to carefully determine the net costs using integrated planning. Secondly, allocate those net costs of carbon-free electricity to participating customers. when we say net here too, just to drive home a point, we use the word net costs rather than costs because we anticipate that there will be costs and benefits. Sometimes the net cost would be negative, that is, there'd be a net benefit. Sometimes the net cost would be positive, that meaning there'd be a net cost. So that's why the term net cost is important here. The third recommendation is that we want to design incentives to manage the demand side so that the demand side has the opportunity to contribute to the effectuation of the 24/7 tariff. And fourth, we want to implement a plan to co-optimize customer and utility investments so that customers aren't overpaying who participate, so that customers who are not participating are not overpaying. We want to pay attention to co-optimizing these customer and utility investments. And now to wrap up with Fundamental 5, I'll turn it back to Sean.
Thanks again, Carl. So this fifth fundamental is about system integration, and it supports the vision. The purpose of a 24/7 tariff like this is to get cleaner resources on the electric system faster, which ultimately at some point is going to affect real-time operations. But as we'll see in the coming slides, the initial system integrations actually don't have to impact real-time operations at all. And wherever you are in the system integration journey, the path forward's been really well documented and continues to be so, as we'll see in the following slide. So these are 4 examples that came up during stakeholder engagement last summer, that standards that are out there to help guide the way. Energy Tag is working with the granular certificate standard. The Emissions First Partnership, think Amazon and others, are working on their version of clean energy standard. The lower middle graphic is the Linux Foundation. They have a work group that is working on a carbon data specification. And then finally, on the far right, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology is on their 4th release of their smart grid interoperability standards, which are really after the full bloom on the rose, just a really fulsome vision of how utility systems can be integrated in service of not just the smart grid, but carbon-free energy as well. If others are aware on the webinar today of other standards efforts, we'd love to know about them and put them in the chat. But as I alluded to at the outset here, the first step in system integration actually can be quite straightforward. You simply want to look backwards in time at actual meter readings from real customers. So that's static data, and then match it up puzzle piece wise with the actual generation as it occurred from those systems, and then simply report it out. A first generation, for example, of a CFE tariff can be that simple, and I wanted to point that out. So the recommendations here for this fundamental are 3-part. Be aware of those standards, consult them, and make good use of them. They're out there for everybody's benefit in our industry. The second recommendation is to just start with actual data. The ex post implementation, the backwards looking implementation is relatively straightforward. And once you've solved that, recommendation 3 starts to come into view, where you start to use forecast data on a future looking basis to implement the product as it gets cleaner and cleaner and closer to 100%. So to wrap up, Carl, back to you.
Sorry. Thank you, Sean. So what we've presented to you today is an approach for considering how to implement 24/7 transition tariff, focusing on 5 fundamentals. The 5 fundamentals that drive an effective tariff and equitable rate design include: first, integrating transition tariff investments with ongoing utility planning; second, ensuring that accurate hourly emissions tracking and verification is in place; third, designing transition tariffs that accelerate complementary investments; Fourth, employing rate design to ensure fairness and to align carbon-free electricity grid needs with pricing and compensation. And fifth, to integrate operating systems to implement hourly matching. Putting these 5 fundamentals together, back one slide, please. Putting these 5 fundamentals together again renders this, virtuous cycle of driving 24/7 carbon-free electricity investment, that some of which would not otherwise occur. That well-designed tariff accelerates investments in innovation that drives emissions down, as we've already discussed. So with that, we will move on to our general question and answer time. We have about 15 minutes left for this portion of our Q&A. We will hang on after the top of the hour for bonus time. So if we don't get to everyone's questions, or if you have other questions that you'd like to discuss, please hang on with us, and we'll be happy to continue talking to you after that. So with respect to questions, one question I wanted to answer sort of toward the beginning here, because I think it's pretty foundational. J. Paul asks, what mechanisms exist to incorporate CFE tariffs into planning processes, and whose responsibility is it to do this? As with any new tariff that's being implemented, it can be brought forward by the customer, by regulators. Ultimately, the utility is going to have to negotiate and work with the customers and the regulators to implement that tariff. So whose responsibility is it? Well, if the way that it's worked so far with 24/7 is that customers have expressed an interest in the availability of a new tariff. So I guess they have the responsibility of bringing forward the idea up till now. Then the utility and the regulators work with that idea to help to design a tariff that is fair and equitable. And as we described, in the case of a 24/7 tariff, due to the incremental investments that it involves, it's important that that 24/7 tariff be connected to and somehow integrated with the utility's ongoing planning processes. So that's how I'd see this thing finding its way through to fruition. Sean, I may toss you Gwen Farnsworth's question here. In order to provide 24/7 clean energy, would the utility need to acquire 100% emissions-free dispatchable generation for that customer? Or would the utility essentially still be using fossil fuel generation for capacity services?
Carl, I can start on part of this, and Sean's muted, and then he could chime in. I mean, we've posed this question as talked about 24/7 transition tariffs, which we see as a way of accommodating the fact that we are not at 100% carbon-free electricity. In some places, we're at 50% using existing resources. You may be at 70%, and we're aiming to get to 100%. So I think the answer to the question is yes, you would be using some fossil generation during this transition period. And the idea is to characterize how much of this carbon-free electricity you have now. And so you're able to say, well, right now we're at whatever the number is, 50%, 60, 70, and we're aiming to get to 100 by X date. And then describe your plan for doing that in terms of additional resources, retiring fossil resources, whatever the plan is, and using the principles that Sean and we have talked about in terms of planning to get to that 100%. Sean, feel free to add in.
Thanks for the rescue, Nancy. Yeah, I agree entirely, of course. And it's back to that progress, not perfection comment that I think I made during some of the earlier slides is, on the path there, fossil's still part of it for a number of years yet. And when we get to the end point where we've reached perfection, if you will, I'm shrugging my shoulders because there's going to be a mix of resources, not all of which we may know about right now, that are going to meet the need. So storage obviously will play a part as we see that vision today, but things will change. And I don't know that we can anticipate exactly what the resources will be at this point.
And I would just add, Gwen, that that the intention is that the customer is accepting responsibility for all of the emissions in providing them service. So the intention is that carbon-free electricity resources would be developed that would ensure that carbon-free electricity was providing those that assurance and reliability at times when previously that customer, like other customers, had been dependent upon fossil-based resources. Bryn Baker asks, can you characterize the emissions first standard? As I understand it, it's not 24/7, and it might be hourly for marginal emissions, but it's not about deliverability. Either Sean or David.
I'm going to let you have that, Sean.
I'll keep it high level. I'm not deeply familiar with it, but it boils down to the difference between attributional and consequential accounting. They're taking a consequential approach. In other words, the new resource that you bring on should be displacing the dirtiest in principle. And it is not, as you point out, about deliverability. So it's fundamentally a different standard, both in the accounting and in its philosophy around what's being displaced and where, because they're letting go of deliverability compared to the way we've approached it.
And the where is certainly very important, because in the dirtier the system, which you put carbon-free energy, the rationale is that you're displacing more CO2.
Thanks. Michael O'Boyle asks, can and should 24/7 tariffs include the incremental costs associated with transmission infrastructure? This seems particularly important given the current delays and high costs associated with transformers and the circuit breakers necessary to construct substations to connect new generation, new loads into the bulk system. Does this raise novel issues for rate making, or is it similar to questions around allocating cost of carbon-free generation? It's a great question, Michael. And I think the intention for 24/7 is to encourage customers who participate in the tariff to drive incremental transmission investment to ensure more delivery of carbon-free electricity resources to meet that 24/7 standard. So I would say, yes, it's quite conceivable that incremental costs associated with transmission could find their way into a tariff, because some of that transmission could be engaged or effectuated specifically to ensure the viability of the 24/7 tariff. With regard to whether that raises novel issues for rate making or not, it's a good question. I don't have a ready answer. I'll pause to see if anybody else has a ready answer, but other than that, I would just say it's a good question. Okay.
Carl, there were
Go
questions
ahead.
on Arkansas. You want me to take, and fairness? Should I do those,
Sure.
or did you?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Nancy.
So one person asked about what did we mean by fairness, and another asked explicitly about Arkansas, the Arkansas Energy effort. So what I would follow up with is that Carl mentioned the UN agreement and that the US signed on. That was then followed by an executive order setting goals for the federal government to get to 100%. I think it said renewable energy, not necessarily carbon-free energy. I'll put something in the chat for everyone. But that led to the General Services Administration, which is the federal government agency that manages all the properties owned by the federal government, to start working with Entergy to be what became the first MOU between the federal government and Entergy on carbon-free electricity. And that we cite that example, one, because it was first of its kind, but two, because it took the position that given the resource mix in Entergy Arkansas service territory, which is about 70% carbon free and 30% non-carbon free, and allows the federal government to claim an existing baseline of 70%. Even though they might have been able to say, well, there's more kilowatt hours available that are carbon free, our percentage of that we're only allowed to claim 70% of those because other ratepayers had pitched in to help develop the rest of the 70% carbon free electricity. So customers who are on this tariff, meaning the federal government, are assigned 70% carbon free and 30% non, which sets then a goal for the federal government seeking to get to 100% to add additional resources that would mean they could claim more than the 70%. So that I hope answers the fairness, and the Entergy or others of us, feel free to chime in, and I'll put that in the chat.
Okay. I want to answer Ashley's question. She's asking, when I think of tariffs, I think of them in terms of federal regulations. Are these 24/7 tariffs optional at the state, regional, or utility company level? If so, who is the regulatory body for these tariffs? So primarily what we had in mind, or the context that we had in mind, was a state regulatory commission. So the state regulator, the utility, would implement the tariff under the guidance of the state regulator, making it available to customers who would opt into it at the state level. It is useful to, while we spend a lot of time thinking about the context where we have vertically integrated utilities rather than the restructured context, just because in the restructured context, the process is simpler. You can enter into a contract with an entity that can ensure you a supply that meets your requirements. And so that's an easier process. So most of the tariffs that we had in mind here and that we're studying were in that context where you still have a distribution utility actively involved, and the tariff would be negotiated in conjunction with refining that utility's planning and the purpose of coming up with rates that would reflect the costs and the benefits of these incremental resources that come into play. Jim Lazar asks a very quick question, so I'll give a quick answer. Hourly is not 100%. Markets clear in 5-minute intervals, not hourly. Is it possible to align the tracking to market clearing process closer to 100% of kilowatt hours? And the answer is yes, it's possible in principle, but in most places in the country today, it's quite a large step forward in progress to go from annual to hourly. So this is a step. towards achieving, true 100%, which, as you note, would require going below an hourly basis. But we think that the infrastructure that has to be put in place, for example, the hourly tracking and verifications, will pave the way for more refined verification over time. Does anybody have anything to add to that answer?
Carl, I would just mention that emissions data is generally released on an hourly basis. It's collected about every 6 minutes, but it's aggregated to hourly if we're talking continuous emissions data.
Thank you. Sean, I see you're unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to put in there? No. Okay. So I was talking. Does anybody else see a question that they would like to answer?
Carl, we're at the top of the hour.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for noticing that. Well, thank you all for being here. We will hang on to take a few more of these questions as we cross the top of the hour. The report, if you haven't already seen it, is available. What's up now, you can download the report directly. It was also placed, links to the report were placed in the chat earlier. Thank you again for being with us today, and we look forward to talking to you more about this topic. Have a good day, or hang on, as you please. Thanks. Okay. Okay. Ken, I hope Ken is still on. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question earlier. I intended to. Ken, your question is about, whether these tariffs are as effective as placing a price on carbon. And wouldn't it be more effective to just place a price on carbon rather than to have a goal-based tariff? And what I would say about that is, first of all, we don't have a price on carbon in many places, and achieving that has proven to be problematic. So given that, how can we make progress now? And the question comes is, how is 24/7 helping us to make progress so that if someday carbon pricing becomes common, we've been making progress in the meantime. And I would say that the contribution of 24/7 is that it is revealing the need for carbon-free resources in a more granular way than other tariffs that exist today. So if a 24/7 tariff is adopted in a particular place, then that leads to, with accurately tracking and verification, a clearer signal of these are the hours when I, as a customer, am depending upon emitting resources, and these other hours I am not. And what can I do as a customer to help to mitigate the carbon emissions that I am contributing to? And so from a customer's perspective, there are things that the customer can do on the demand side that are complementary to where those high emission hours are, that allows them to help towards building that portfolio of supply and demand resources that enable 24/7. For some customers, there's the opportunity to invest in incremental carbon-free electricity resources. Some folks who have an aspiration for 24/7 are interested in driving investment in technologies like long duration storage uh, or making virtual power plants verifiable and carbon free in a way that they can be relied upon in those high emitting hours. Or as Mike asked about transmission, helping to make sure that transmission gets built to areas where there are complementary carbon-free electricity resources that can be brought to bear to fill out that local 24/7 portfolio. So what I would say is to you is that these tariffs can provide an important opportunity for customers to contribute to decarbonizing in ways that are not happening today. And were we to get granular carbon electricity pricing on a national basis at some point, perhaps these things would get taken care of more naturally, but so far that's proven elusive. Does anybody else see a question they'd like to answer?
Well, Carl, there's the question about what states are doing the most to further and which ones are further along in developing 24/7 clean energy tariffs. And I think it's really interesting to you made a point earlier on that because there is different activity occurring around the country. This idea, it's a voluntary tariff that builds on existing green voluntary tariffs that are available around the country in lots of places. So discussions are occurring in utilities that are thinking about building on what they're doing today. Some of those efforts, for example, in Dominion and Duke territory, they've started to build on this idea. They're trying to fashion their own version of what's happening here. Entergy Arkansas is, I think, a really interesting example. We mentioned that with respect to the federal government's engagement there. And what they're doing is currently tracking hourly existing CFE. So they're taking that first step. So when we talked about the ideal tracking system, Entergy Arkansas is taking a first step, not new resources, but existing resources, and they're tracking those in an hourly manner, and that's MRETS is doing that. Thinking about this only from the point of view of states, I think is one way, but it's important to see other activity out there. There's a firm called RPD. They've provided some really interesting services to Iron Mountain, which is a large company that has lots of, basically their business is data. And so they've got large data servers in the Midwest. And when you look at what RPD is offering them, there are over 250 accounts, Iron Mountain accounts that are being served. They're aggregated, but they're being served by RPD across multiple utilities and multiple RTOs. But what RPD is doing is something not quite along the lines of what we're talking about today. What they're doing is going out and buying as much in the way of energy and capacity as possible to meet the varied needs of all those Iron Mountain accounts. And what appears to be happening is that they're overbuying so they can do the matching that's required. And what they're doing is buying the output of all sorts of different clean energy resources and retiring the traditional RECs, which makes sure that that energy is not being double counted, but they're not taking advantage of the hourly REC platform that we were talking about. And it's such an interesting model to consider because what they're doing demonstrates the need of what we're hearing from Princeton University, and Jesse Jenkins and colleagues work there. They're saying you need to develop a market for these certificates because if you have to overbuy lots of output from projects, there's a lot of that output you're not able to use. Well, if there isn't a secondary market for that, you're just simply not using it. You're retiring it. We thank you for that, but it's not really as efficient an approach as might be out there if they were able to take the certificates to match the times that they don't really need to use to meet Iron Mountain's needs. So those are some examples. You have some utilities doing things, and you have companies experimenting in other ways.
I would just add in a couple more. Thanks, Dave. A lot of great information there. Just add a couple more. You know, I'm pretty impressed with what some of the community choice aggregators are doing in California. Peninsula Clean Energy in the San Mateo County area of the Bay Area has designed a 24/7 carbon-free electricity portfolio that it's building towards over the next couple of years, making it available to customers as their default tariff with them. So that's an interesting one. Silicon Valley Clean Energy has worked with its some large commercial customers to implement integrated tariffs that allow the customer to make investments to improve their facility and increase the ability of their facility to provide clean energy to itself and to the grid, at the same time adapting procurement from Silicon Valley Clean Energy itself to fill out the entities that subscribe to that tariff. So anyway, those are a couple of examples, but there are more interesting examples happening in community choice aggregation. Okay. Does anybody have another question that they'd like to jump into, or do you want me to pick one?
Carl, there was Michael McCrae had a follow-up question that Dave partially answered, I think, in terms of RECs and how to RECs mesh with this program is how I'm reacting to it. And I guess my reaction is that it's kind of different currency. So yes, if you're trying to go to hourly, you should make sure that the RECs haven't gone to some other person. So you're kind of double counting the carbon-free electricity. But it's not, it doesn't, I don't really see it as RECs is meshing with what we're talking about in the transition tariff. But others here may have a different perspective. It is important, as Michael poses in the question, if you were selling them to one party, but now somebody wants to use them for a claim, they need to at least go to the party that's making the 24/7 claim, but it's not sufficient in terms of having hourly certificates of CFE in the sort of hourly system we've been talking about is necessary for the tariff.
That's right. Green tariffs have traditionally been defined as something in addition to the regulatory requirements for renewables and RPS, for example. And they've always been considered separately.
Sean, I don't know if you can decline if you want, but there's the question about system losses, since you crafted the section on the utility aligning their system with hourly. Wondering if you have any thoughts about that one.
I've been avoiding it, Carl, to be honest, because the losses are in an RTO context captured usually in the locational marginal price and are kind of I think tangential might be the right word in my mind, issue with respect to the emissions attribute certificate or the timestamped REC, if you want to call it that. So Yeah, the way contractually an electron is divided up and traded wholesale, losses to my experience haven't been part of these emissions attributes. Caveat there being is that to the degree storage gets involved here, and it will, there is an emerging specification to deal explicitly with this issue, with losses, through the emissions tracking standard that Energy Tag, for example, is working on. So it's a very important topic, but I can't think of a way to deal with it outside the context of storage. And this question was broader than that. It's about system.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for taking a stab at it. Bridget, I'll try to answer your question, although I'm not totally sure what you mean. But you ask, would you consider this tariff to be a must-take for the utility? So I think once the let's consider a context where a tariff has been established and people can subscribe to that tariff, and that tariff renders then an obligation on the utility and on the customer to deliver on the terms of that tariff. So one of the aspects of the tariff that we didn't talk about very much was the duration of the tariff. And so there is a concern that when you sign up for these tariffs, there needs to be some obligation to stay with the tariff so that you don't have resources that are procured for the purpose of complying with the tariff, but then no longer perhaps economic for general use. And so I would say with regard to that, you have to have durational provisions in the tariff that make it clear that what the obligations are on the customer are when they subscribe to the tariff, so that you don't end up in a situation where other customers end up having to pay extra cost that weren't contemplated because the customers exit from the tariff. So that's possibly an answer to your question, but I'm not sure. And Gwen, I don't know if you're still on or not, but in terms of economic development tariffs and just generally all other tariffs, there is this question of how does 24/7 align with or get implemented in concert with those other tariffs. And I'm just going to say that I think it depends, it depends on the context. If there is a economic development tariff that exists and the customer wanting to subscribe to that tariff has some 24/7 delivery preferences, I would think that it would be, a different tariff that would be done in recognition of the economic development tariff, not replacing it, but hopefully done in a way where it is complementary to it. So I hope that gets at your question, but if not, feel free to reach out. Any final thoughts from folks as we say goodbye? Oh, okay. Well, thank you again for joining us. Please reach out to us. We'd all be interested in talking to you more about this topic. And I look forward to seeing how this develops in the coming weeks and months. Have a good day.